The movie opens with a scenic view of a city where several people can be seen dancing joyously. It appears as though they're celebrating a wedding. Gautam, an Indian Foreign Services officer, who is as laid-back as can be, had previously fallen in love with Ira, a free-spirited social worker. The two met at a French university and instantly clicked with one another. Being the complete opposites, Gautam and Ira fell madly in love with one another and soon decided to get married. During their wedding, a huge celebration occurs and the two lovers happily tie the knot with their family's blessings. Shortly after, the reception party is held where all the members of Gautam and Ira's family have a great time. At one point, Gautam even gets up and confesses his love to Ira while thanking her for always being there for him. He then presents her with a stunning ring which just so happens to be his family's heirloom. Whilst all this is going on, Jaggy, a wild-hearted hockey player, gatecrashes the party. He sneakily tries to enjoy himself to the fullest despite having no connection to either the bride or the groom. Impressed by Gautam's confession, Jaggy praises the latter and claps loudly. This instantly garners the attention of all the guests present at the party. Anxious and scared, Jaggy's friends try to stop him from creating a commotion, but the latter doesn't listen to them at all. Instead, he approaches Ira and congratulates her for marrying such a wonderful man. Gautam and Ira initially think nothing of this, but soon after, they realize that Jaggy isn't related to either of them. Confused, Gautam approaches Jaggy and his friends and asks them why they've crashed the wedding. In response, the three boys just laugh and apologize to Gautam whilst being completely wasted. Needless to say, the latter is furious by this behavior and immediately kicks them out of the wedding. Soon, 3 years pass by and now Jaggy can be seen hiking up a mountain. He travels through a very dangerous trail and even destroys all his identification cards in the process. Whilst burning all his documents, he opens up a very crumpled wedding card and smiles. He then gently kisses the paper before burning it off as well. It appears as though he's trying to get into a country illegally. Together, he and his gang travel through several countries and endure harsh conditions to achieve their goal. Whilst going to London, Jaggy asks one of the fellow immigrants present there about his family. In response, the latter tells Jaggy that his entire family had recently been killed in a bombing. Because of this, he is now forced to go to his cousin based in London. Intrigued, Jaggy asks the boy, whose name is Bilal, more about his cousin's brother. That's when Bilal explains that his cousin had actually clung onto the tires of a plane and somehow managed to get to London. After hearing this, almost everyone around him laughs and mocks him for lying. However, Jaggy just smiles and wishes him all the best. Shortly after, Bilal asks Jaggy about his story, and that's when the latter asserts that he's going to London to reunite with his love. The two then chat for a while and eventually fall asleep. However, just then, their truck comes to a sudden halt. Confused, Jaggy and Bilal look around and see the driver hurriedly walking over to them. Upon reaching the immigrants, the driver informs them that they're about to reach a checkpost, so they'll have to be careful. To escape the military, they'll have to somehow evade their checking machine. After hearing all this, Bilal gets nervous and tells Jaggy that he won't be able to do it. Thankfully, the latter consoles him and asks him to stay strong. Within moments, the truck reaches a massive port in France where several security militants and dogs are on high alert. After realizing the danger, Jaggy and all his gang members cover their heads in a plastic bag and completely stop breathing. However, while doing so, Bilal starts suffocating and tries to remove the plastic wrap around his head. Seeing this, the others grab him tightly and prevent him from exposing their plan to the militants. Unable to control himself any longer, Jaggy jumps in and tries to save Bilal, but this just ends up creating a loud noise. Unfortunately, the militants hear this and capture Jaggy's gang, which ultimately results in him getting beat up pretty badly. The scene now changes to Gautam, who appears to be at an illegal immigrant holding facility. As he enters the place, he is approached by a woman who asks him to identify any Indian immigrant that has been captured. It turns out that Jaggy himself is also at the same facility. After being captured, he is interrogated by several officers, but he simply refuses to answer. He stays silent for a prolonged period. Just then, Jaggy sees Gautam standing right in front of him. Now hopeful, he immediately gets up and calls out to him. However, Gautam doesn't even recognize him and just continues talking to all the other officers there. Anxious and desperate, Jaggy proceeds to talk about the ruckus he caused at Gautam's wedding, which finally helps the latter remember everything. Shortly after, Gautam takes Jaggy to a private room and asks him the reason for entering France illegally. He then berates Jaggy for tarnishing the name of India internationally. Guilt-ridden, the latter proceeds to explain that he never wanted to commit such a crime. He then goes on to add that his intention was never to earn easy money or to run away from his family. Hearing this, Gautam just smirks and ridicules him for being such a loser. But despite such harsh comments, Jaggy just smiles and explains that his inspiration for pulling off such a task was Gautam himself. Confused, the latter asks him to elaborate further, and that's when Jaggy goes on to talk about his love story. The scene now changes to a flashback of about 3 months ago where Jaggy appears to be playing hockey. It turns out that he's a proficient hockey player who has been selected to play at the All India sports meet. Whilst training, Jaggy and his mates go over to the swimming pool and stare at all the gorgeous girls there. The three talk amongst each other about how all the girls are so fit and stunning. Right then, Jaggy takes notice of a really beautiful girl. Completely blown away by her beauty, he just can't take his eyes off her. However, the girl, Kartika, quickly notices this and approaches the three boys. Just as she's doing so, Jaggi gets in front of her and asks his friends to click their pictures together. Needless to say, Kartika notices this and poses angrily. She then confronts Jaggi and insults him for taking her picture without permission. Furious, Kartika walks away with her friend while Jaggi just stands behind and giggles in excitement. Despite Kartika warning him to delete the picture, he confidently posts it on Facebook and gains a lot of likes and comments. Soon enough, the picture goes viral and almost everyone at the sports meet sees it. When Kartika finds out about this, she decides to get her revenge on Jaggi. Together, she and her friend, Sheena, barge into the boys' changing room and begin recording. The two manage to capture a video of all the boys in the room without their consent as revenge. A while later, Sheena and Kartika start looking around for Jaggi. Eventually, the latter finds Jaggi showering at a nearby stall. Kartika immediately starts recording Jaggi, assuming that this might embarrass him. But on the contrary, Jaggi gets excited and proceeds to pose sensually whilst being completely naked. This surprises Kartika, but she doesn't give up. She continues recording several videos. However, in the process, she becomes attracted to Jaggi and just stares at him longingly. Sheena arrives right at that moment and just like Kartika, she stares at Jaggi with widened eyes. Embarrassed, the two hurriedly walk out whilst Jaggi just stays back and laughs. The next day, Jaggi enters the training zone only to see Kartika and her team getting yelled at by their coach. Needless to say, he feels bad for Kartika and just waits in the corner to cheer her up. However, the latter simply walks past him while asserting that she's not in the mood for any jokes. Frustrated, she gets ready to train. Just as she's about to jump into the water, she notices Jaggi staring at her body intently. Now infuriated, she yells at the latter for being such a pervert and asks him to go away. However, despite getting multiple threats, Jaggi doesn't budge and just admires Kartika. He watches her swim and even cheers for her. After realizing that Jaggi is going nowhere, Kartika simply sighs and asks him to time her instead. Excited, Jaggi readily agrees and helps Kartika achieve her goal. Kartika trains for a long time while Jaggi just sits there and records her timing. Eventually, Kartika gets tired and asks Jaggi if she has improved. Sadly, it turns out that she's still a couple of seconds behind the required time. This makes Kartika upset as she doesn't have much time. But instead of consoling her, Jaggi just teases her for being overweight and runs away giggling. This comment finally becomes the last straw for Kartika. Furious, she walks over to where Jaggi is practicing and confronts him about the offensive remark. She yells at him for being so insensitive. However, that's when Jaggi claims that the only reason for her being overweight is the heavy burden she's carrying. Jaggi explains to Kartika that she isn't enjoying swimming. Rather, she is just stressing herself out by trying so hard to achieve the required goal. He adds that this heavy burden is the only reason for her failure. Kartika finally understands Jaggi and calms down. She realizes that she's not happy or excited about swimming. Instead, she's just scared and worried about her upcoming competition, which isn't allowing her to become the best version of herself. After coming to terms with herself, Kartika becomes determined to enjoy herself whilst also giving her all. She swims for as long as she can and doesn't give up. Meanwhile, Jaggi motivates her from afar and asks her to swim faster. At one point, Kartika gets annoyed by Jaggi's silly remarks. She asks him to stop irritating her as she's trying to do her best. However, Jaggi just ignores her and starts mocking her for swimming so slowly. This infuriates Kartika and so she pushes him into the pool. Initially, Jaggi flails around whilst claiming that he can't swim. However, Kartika just assumes that he's lying and leaves him in the water. Soon, a couple of seconds pass by and Jaggi starts drowning. Eventually, he loses consciousness and ends up at the bottom of the pool. When Kartika notices this, she immediately jumps into the water and drags him out. Panicking, she gives him CPR and somehow manages to save him. With tears streaming down her face, she profusely apologizes to Jaggi and promises that she'll never do such a thing again. However, Jaggi just smiles and thanks Kartika for kissing him. Confused, the latter explains that she was just giving him CPR, but Jaggi simply refuses to listen. This annoys Kartika, ultimately causing her to walk away angrily. Later that day, Jaggi goes to Kartika's room and apologizes for making fun of her. He then invites her to a small party. Kartika is initially hesitant about the party, but after a while, she agrees and even brings Sheena with her. Kartika, Sheena, Jaggi, and all his friends end up having a great time. They get closer to one another than ever before. Kartika and Jaggi even begin spending almost every single second with one another. They go to various parties, clubs, and restaurants together. Eventually, Kartika and Jaggi even teach each other their respective sports. They support each other through everything and get close. Soon enough, Jaggi falls madly in love with Kartika and even Kartika starts to like Jaggi. One day, while the two are enjoying themselves at a party, Kartika gets up and walks back to her room. Not wanting to let her go alone, Jaggi accompanies her and drops her to her room. But just as the two are about to part ways, Kartika kisses Jaggi passionately. Overwhelmed with feelings, the two make love and spend the night together. The next morning, Sheena catches Jaggi and Kartika together. Utterly shocked, she informs the latter that this isn't right, It turns out that Kartika's father, who's a really powerful man, is coming back to India to watch her compete. When Kartika realizes this, she immediately gets ready and prepares for the swimming tournament. She tries to forget Jaggi and just focuses on winning the competition. Meanwhile, Jaggi also comes to the tournament and loudly cheers for Kartika. He jumps around and motivates the latter to do her best. When Kartika's father notices this, he immediately suspects that something is up. However, he stays silent and continues cheering Kartika on. Eventually, Kartika fulfills her dream and wins the competition. Everyone in the audience erupts into claps and cheers. After some time, Kartika runs back to her parents and celebrates her victory. Just then, Jaggi arrives at the scene and praises her for doing so well. In turn, Kartika happily thanks him for his help and then introduces him to her parents. She tells them that Jaggi is her friend who had helped her train for the competition. When Kartika's mother hears this, she gets excited and invites Jaggi to their party. Excited, the latter inquires about the occasion only to find out that the party has been organized to celebrate Kartika's upcoming wedding. As soon as Jaggi learns about this, his whole world comes crashing down. His expression completely changes while Kartika drags her parents away. It turns out that Kartika's wedding had already been fixed for a guy named Karan. All the preparations had already commenced and even the wedding cards had been printed out. After learning about all this, Jaggi simply stays silent and doesn't know how to react. He goes back to this training and tries his hardest to forget about her. Unable to control his feelings anymore, Jaggi approaches Kartika and confronts her about the wedding. He asks her why she never mentioned Karan and simply continued to lead him on. In response, Kartika replies that she never led him on. Rather, she wanted to stay away from him, but it was he who never left her alone. Eventually, she asks Jaggi to let bygones be bygones as she wants to marry Karan. She then asks him to move on. However, this comment just agitates Jaggi further. Annoyed, he demands a decent explanation from Kartika. That's when the latter explains that she never planned any of this and she's doing all this because her parents have already decided everything. In the end, she apologizes to Jaggi and wishes him all the very best in life. Now enraged, Jaggi curses her for using him and storms away angrily. Later that night, Kartika and Sheena go to a party to distract themselves from everything that has happened. The two try to have fun and relax. Sadly, this doesn't last long as Jaggi arrives at the scene and starts singing a song. He begins dancing around and even goes over to Kartika. The latter initially doesn't understand his intention, so she just stays silent and enjoys the dance. A while later, Kartika just smiles at Jaggi and chats with him. Halfway through, Jaggi begs her to not marry Karan and confesses his love for her. However, Kartika simply replies that she has no choice as the wedding had already been fixed long ago. She then tells him that they've only known each other for a couple of days, so falling in love in such a short time is impossible. Eventually, she suggests that they just remain friends and keep in touch. However, this doesn't sit right with Jaggi. Curious, he asks Kartika why she's getting married so soon. In response, the latter replies that she's not marrying Karan for love. Rather, she's marrying him to settle down and be comfortable. After hearing Kartika's reasoning, Jaggi simply smiles and tells her that she hasn't ever experienced true love. Emotional, he asserts that he's madly in love with her and that he'll always love her. He then begs Kartika to cancel the wedding. Sadly, the latter doesn't agree and claims that she isn't impractical. In an attempt to convince Jaggi, she asks him to come to London in 3 months. She proposes that if he still loves her by that time, then she'll happily cancel the wedding. Hearing this, Jaggi becomes elated and spends the rest of the night dancing with Kartika. Eventually, the party ends and Kartika leaves along with her friends. Just as she's about to walk away, Jaggi runs up to Kartika and shows her the wedding invitation card. He then crosses out Karan's name and writes his name on the card instead. Kartika just smiles at the gesture and leaves. The scene now shifts back to the present where Jaggi finally finishes telling his story to Gautam. After hearing Jaggi's entire confession, Gautam inquires as to why he didn't apply for a visa. That's when the latter replies that his visa actually got rejected and an agent took all his money and ran away. Because of this, he simply had no other choice. Jaggi then tells Gautam that despite being called crazy by almost everyone, he is determined to marry Kartika. He continues and thanks Gautam for such an inspiring speech at the reception party. Excited, he claims that the confession was what gave him the strength to endure all his hardships. Upon hearing this, Gautam's expression just changes into one of utter sadness. Now solemn, he reveals to Jaggi that he and Ira are separated. About 3 months ago, Gautam and Ira had gotten into a huge fight involving illegal immigrants. Whilst Ira felt sympathy for the poor immigrants, Gautam just wanted to do his job. When he found out about a gang of refugees living illegally in France, he immediately reported them to the officials without an ounce of remorse. This made Ira furious, ultimately causing them to get into a massive argument. Soon after, the two parted ways and never looked back. After explaining everything to Jaggi, Gautam asks the latter to go back home as that's the only option he has. However, the latter persists and begs Gautam to help him. Sadly, Gautam refuses to do so and books a flight to India instead. Anxious and scared, Jaggi tries his hardest to convince Gautam but ends up failing miserably. Shortly after, the two leave for the airport. Halfway through, Gautam gets a call from his colleague explaining that the flight has been delayed due to some other illegal immigrants being found. Because of this, the two are forced to stay at a nearby airport hotel. Once there, they too relax for a while until Gotham gets another call from his colleague. Now desperate, Jaggy quickly takes this opportunity to jump out the window and escapes. He runs straight to Calais port where he reunites with Bilal and the rest of the gang. At the port, Jaggy tells Bilal that he has to reach London soon and asks the latter if there's any other way to get there. Sadly, Bilal claims that it's almost impossible to reach London without money. Just as the two are talking, Jaggy gets attacked by some other immigrants. The attackers demand money from him and beat him up pretty badly. Having no other option, Jaggy tells the assailants that he will call Gotham and ask for some money. Thankfully, the men agree and hand Jaggy a phone. However, instead of calling Gotham, Jaggy calls Kartika and informs her that he's coming to London soon. Kartika initially doesn't believe him and just laughs, thinking it's a prank. She chats with him for a while until the attackers realize that something is wrong. When they find out that Jaggy is talking to a girl, they snatch the phone away from him and beat him brutally. On the other end of the phone, Kartika hears Jaggy's shrieks and asks if everything is okay. But before they can talk further, Jaggy passes out, and the call ends. Now anxious, Kartika asks Sheena for help as she doesn't know what to do. However, the latter just berates her for giving Jaggy false hope. In response, Kartika defends herself, claiming that she never told Jaggy she loved him and all that he's doing is just ridiculous. On the other hand, Jaggy gets rushed to the hospital to get treated. When Gotham hears about this, he immediately rushes to the hospital and checks on Jaggy. Thankfully, all of his wounds were minor, which resulted in him getting discharged pretty soon. Shortly after, Gotham and Jaggy return to the detention center. Whilst traveling, Gotham calls his colleague to ask more about Jaggy's flight. Unfortunately, he comes to find out that the plane has already departed. When Jaggy hears this, he gets excited and looks out the window. That's when he notices the vast English Channel. Curious, he asks Gotham about the other end of the sea. Much to his surprise, he learns that the channel is directly connected to England. Thrilled, he walks out of the car and carefully observes the channel. He then tells Gotham that if nothing works out, he'll just swim to the other end and reach London. Hearing this, the latter just laughs and asserts that the channel is 20 miles long. He further adds that the water is freezing, so jumping into the sea would be nothing more than a mission. Right at that moment, Gotham gets another call from his colleague, stating that the detention center is closed. Furthermore, he learns that since no other flights are available, Jaggy's deportation has been postponed for 2 days. Because of this, he is now forced to keep Jaggy with him. Shortly after, the two go to a nearby bar for some food and drinks. Once there, Jaggy notices a gorgeous French girl sitting beside him. He stares at her for quite a while and eventually approaches her. The two talk for some time and have a lot of fun. Later, Gotham teases Jaggy for flirting with the girl and somehow even getting her address. The two then eagerly drive to their destination only for Gotham to realize that the address belongs to a clothing store. Turns out that Jaggy never liked the girl. Rather, he liked her dress and wanted to buy a similar one for Kartika. Moving forward, Gotham and Jaggy enter the store where the latter decides to purchase the stunning dress. But before doing so, he borrows Gotham's phone and calls Kartika. As soon as she picks up, Jaggy greets her and asks for her dress size. Utterly confused, Kartika tells him to stop pranking her. That's when Jaggy clarifies that he really is in France and even promises that he'll reach London soon. When Kartika hears this, she starts panicking and begs Jaggy to return home. She explains that she can't cancel the wedding as everything is already decided. Before she can say anything more, her battery dies and the calls abruptly end. Back at the clothing store, Jaggy just smiles and tells Gotham that Kartika's phone died. He then happily buys the dress before walking back into the car. Despite all of Kartika's warnings, Jaggy remains hopeful about marrying her and spending the rest of their lives together. The next morning, Jaggy and Gotham have breakfast together. Whilst eating, Jaggy asks Gotham if he still misses Ira. Much to his dismay, the latter remains silent and pretends to be busy. Jaggy quickly notices the loneliness in Gotham's eyes and encourages him to pursue Ira. However, the latter refuses to do so and claims that Ira left him according to her own will. Hearing this, Jaggy grimaces and snatches Gotham's phone. He then calls Ira and hands the phone back to Gotham. The latter is initially shocked, but after Ira picks up the call, he calms down and talks to her. Whilst conversing, Ira asks Gotham to meet her and the latter happily agrees. Things finally start to get better. Later that day, Gotham excitedly goes to meet Ira. There, the two hug and start chatting. Gotham believes that Ira is there to forgive him, but on the contrary, she starts crying. With tears streaming down her face, she asks Gotham for a divorce. She hands him the family heirloom and explains that they are way too different. Furious, Gotham simply stays silent and signs all of the divorce papers. He then storms out of the place. Jaggy, who had been there the whole time, quickly follows Gotham and tries to console him. While walking, Jaggy comes across a swimwear store. Curious, he looks at all the swimming gear and tells Gotham that if needed, he'll just swim to London. Hearing this, Gotham drags Jaggy to a local swimming pool and asks him to practice. He angrily asks the latter to swim 20 miles without any support. Jaggy is initially confused, but after some time, he begins swimming and tries his hardest to continue. Sadly, he gets tired pretty soon and starts drowning. That's when Gautam yells at him for being so blind. He exclaims that Kartika never planned on marrying him and begs him to just move on. Furious, he takes Jaggi back to his apartment and locks him inside a room. He then asserts that he'll only open the door when it's time for the deportation. Soon after, Gautam goes to the living room and starts drinking heavily. Eventually, he passes out whilst thinking of Ira. The next morning, Gautam wakes up to find Ira in front of him. Stunned, he asks her why she's here. That's when Ira replies that she received 10 missed calls from him the other night. Because of this, she got extremely worried and rushed to him. When Gautam hears this, he becomes utterly confused. He then looks at Jaggi's room only to find the door open. It turns out that Jaggi had somehow broken out of the room and ran away in the middle of the night. But before leaving, he had called Ira several times in an attempt to make things right. After realizing what Jaggi is about to do, Gautam immediately starts looking for him. Ira also contacts several of her social workers to track him down. Together, the two try to come up with a solution to save him. On the other hand, Kartika receives a voicemail from Jaggi confessing his love to her and assuring her that he'll reach her by any means possible. This comment scares Kartika, so she hurriedly calls Gautam. Panicking, she asks him about Jaggi. In response, Gautam simply tells her that Jaggi is missing and that he's trying to find him. Meanwhile, Jaggi, who is now determined to get to London, finally reaches the channel and prepares to swim. He dresses into the necessary gear and jumps into the freezing water. At the same time, Kartika's wedding procession begins. She tries her hardest to relax, but the voicemail from Jaggi continues to haunt her. While Gautam and Ira drive towards the channel, Jaggi remains determined and continues swimming. He swims for hours until his body finally gives up. Eventually, he starts drowning and sinks to the bottom of the sea. Thankfully, two strangers save him and pull him into their boat. Back in London, Kartika gets increasingly worried about Jaggi and breaks down. She realizes just how much he loves her and prays for his well-being. The scene now shifts back to Jaggi, who finally seems to be in a stable condition. It turns out that after being saved by the Coast Guard, Gautam brought him back to his house and called in several medical professionals to take care of him. At present, after hours of treatment, Jaggi is finally out of danger. Seeing this, Gautam calls Kartika and tells her all about Jaggi's plan. When the latter learns about this, she becomes speechless. Tears stream down her eyes as she can't seem to decide what to do. While sobbing, she asks Gautam for advice, who simply asks her to think thoroughly before taking any decision. Kartika agrees to the suggestion and quickly hangs up. She then proceeds to go back to her wedding. However, that's when she runs into her father, who had accidentally heard everything. With a serious expression, the two sit down and talk about Jaggi. After realizing that Jaggi truly loves her, Kartika tells her father that she wants to cancel the wedding. She realizes her true feelings for him and wishes to marry him instead of Karen. Upon hearing this, her father becomes incredibly angry and asks her to think practically. He tells that she has to consider her future and settle with a man who can take care of her. Kartika's father then confesses to her that when she was just 9 years old, he had fallen in love with another woman. Sadly, he had to let her go and choose his family instead. Despite never truly being in love with his wife, he had to compromise and spend the rest of his life protecting his family. Finally, Kartika's father asks her to become a realist and compromise, because sooner or later, love will fade away. With no other choice left, Kartika timidly agrees and decides to continue with the wedding. On the other hand, Jaggi recovers from all his ailments and comes back to his senses. After realizing that it's impossible to get to London, he becomes depressed and starts sobbing. With tears running down his eyes, he tells Gautam that he has failed. During all this, the latter simply stays quiet and continues to listen to him. Just then, he gets a call from Kartika and hands it to Jaggi. Jaggi quickly picks up the call and tries his best to maintain a happy facade. However, Kartika immediately freaks out on him and yells at him for being so immature. Both of them start sobbing violently. Eventually, Kartika also confesses that she loves him, which shocks Jaggi. Now more excited than ever, he tells Kartika that he'll always love her. Shortly after, Gautam smiles at Jaggi and tells him that his wish is about to come true. After seeing the latter's passion and kind-heartedness, Gautam realizes his mistake and decides to help him. To send Jaggi to London, Gautam sneaks into his office and destroys the deportation file. Meanwhile, Kartika also realizes that she's making a mistake by marrying Karen. She musters up every ounce of courage she has and rushes to her father's office. Once there, she asserts that she's canceling the wedding. As expected, her father yells at her, but she doesn't budge. Instead, she stands her ground and calls her father weak for not making the right choice. This comment infuriates the latter, so he drags her out of his office and locks her up in a room. Back in France, Gautam pulls several strings so that Jaggi can go to London legally. He changes Jaggi's name and creates fake documents to avoid any kind of suspicion. He then calls his colleagues to ask for a visa. When Ira learns about this, she gets really worried and warns Gautam that this might turn into a huge mess. She tells him that if things go wrong, he could very easily go to jail. In response, Gautam simply replies that he has already lost enough. Even though his own love story wasn't successful, he is determined to reunite Jaggi with Kartika. Meanwhile, Jaggi goes to visit Bilal for the last time. Excited, he tells the latter that he's finally going to London with the help of Gautam. He then proceeds to console Bilal and asks him to stay safe. In the end, the two chat for some time, and Jaggi finally leaves. On the other hand, Kartika's situation just gets worse. Her parents start fighting with one another about Jaggi while still having her locked up in a room. Just when she starts to think that all hope is lost, Sheena enters the room and sneakily hands her a phone. Now relieved, Kartika immediately calls Jaggi and tells him that she's coming to him. However, the latter stops her and explains that he's coming to London with his visa and passport. Hearing this, Kartika gets excited and tells Jaggi that she has cancelled her wedding. In response, Jaggi simply tells her that he's okay with her marrying Karen. He goes on to add the reason he endured all this was to show her that she's his one true love. When Kartika hears this, she becomes emotional and promises Jaggi that she'll be waiting for him. The very next day, Jaggi and Gautam get ready to board their flight. The two quickly leave for the airport after checking all their documents. Whilst traveling, Gautam hands Jaggi his family heirloom ring and asks him to keep it safe. Incredibly emotional, the latter hugs Gautam tightly and promises to always cherish the ring. Shortly after, the two reach the airport and somehow manage to evade all the security successfully. Back at the detention center, Bilal realizes that he'll never be able to reach London. With no other option left, he goes over to the officers and begs them to grant him legal citizenship. In return, he promises to give them all the information he has. Now curious, the officers agree to his request, and that's when Bilal confesses that Jaggi is about to enter London illegally. He tells them all about Jaggi's plan and even informs them about Gautam's help. As a result, several officers immediately enter the airport and warn the pilots about Jaggi. Thankfully, Jaggi evades the authorities just in time and prepares to board the flight. However, that's when he notices several other police officers standing right in front of the plane. This causes him to panic, and so he hides behind the tires of the massive aircraft. On the other hand, Gautam gets caught by the officers and is questioned thoroughly. But despite being threatened, he remains quiet and pretends as though Jaggi was never with him. Soon enough, he is proven innocent and is even allowed to board the flight. However, when Gautam gets on the plane, he notices that Jaggi is nowhere to be found. It turns out that the latter had actually escaped from the officers and sneakily clung onto the aircraft's landing gear. Eventually, when the plane finally takes off, Jaggi scoots over to a small space beside the tires and clings onto the pillars with all the strength he has. The temperature is freezing, but he holds onto the landing gear. Soon after, Jaggi loses consciousness due to the excessive cold and begins dreaming about reuniting with Kartika. He imagines himself marrying her and living happily ever after. But sadly, it seems that destiny had other plans for the lovers, because even when the plane is about to land, Jaggi fails to gain consciousness. As the landing gear slowly starts to open, the unconscious Jaggi slips into the open skies. Eventually, he falls to his death from an altitude of thousands of feet. Soon after, the plane finally lands and Gautam hurriedly rushes out only to find out about Jaggi's death. Now devastated, he goes to Kartika and hands her the dress that Jaggi had so enthusiastically bought for her. He then tells her about the tragic news, leaving Kartika traumatized. A year later, on Jaggi's death anniversary, Gautam tells this epic love story to all his friends. It turns out that after realizing what true love is, he finally reconciled with Ira. At present, standing in front of an audience that includes Sheena, Kartika, and all of Jaggi's friends, Gautam narrates the intense story and explains that love is forever. Hearing this, Kartika also gets up and pays her tribute to Jaggi. The movie finally concludes with Jaggi's loved ones remembering and celebrating him.